morning, students and staff of the IIS and AKU-ISMC, distinguished guests joining us both in person and online, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first IIS AKU-ISMC graduate conference. They say knowledge is power, so get ready to become superheroes by the end of today's program. My name is Aqil Visram. I am a student of the GPISH program at the IIS, and I will be your Master of Ceremonies today. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Zayn Kassam, Director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Professor Zayn Kassam is Director of the IIS and Head of Department of Research and Academic Research and Publications. Born and raised in Kenya, Professor Kassam completed her BA in Religious Studies at McGill University, her MA in Islamic Studies at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University, and her PhD in History of Religions at the Faculty of Religious Studies at McGill University, where she specialized in medieval Islamic and Indian philosophy. Before coming to the IIS, Professor Kassam taught at Pomona College, a highly selective liberal arts college in the USA, where she developed her expertise in and taught courses on gender, environment, community engagement, in addition to her specializations in Islam, methods in the study of religions, and Sufism, as well as Islamic philosophy. She has received several awards for distinguished teaching. In addition, Professor Kassam has served on the board of the American Academy of Religion as co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, and is on the editorial board for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. She has chaired several departments and committees at Pomona College, and has also held the position of Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome Professor Zayn Kassam to the stage to inaugurate the graduate conference.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Aqil. I almost didn't recognize myself, but anyway, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you very warmly to the Aga Khan Center for the inaugural conference that has been organized by graduate students from IIS and ISMC. This is the first ever occasion that I know of where this has happened, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see collaboration between two of the institutions that share that building, but also to give students an opportunity to showcase and talk about their work. So a very warm welcome to all of you, to each of you. Now, one of the things that my students used to groan and complain about is when on their first day I would have them read Edward Said. And they'd say, Professor, do we have to read theory? Why can't we just get to the wonderful novels or the other readings or really understand what Islam is about, or Sufism or Islamic philosophy or gender? Why do we need to read Said? And this is the kind of thing that we know, all of us, that as graduate students, whether we are now professors or not, or whether we're still in the pipeline of being graduate students, that learning how to connect theoretical frameworks to what it is, the topic that we are examining, is absolutely essential. Because what do theoretical frameworks do? So for instance, when you think of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who really made a very significant intervention in the field of religious studies when he said, bracket out, capital T, truth. Now, what that did was that it allowed people in religious studies to step away from having to defend their personal faiths in the study of religion, but rather opened up the possibility of looking at the phenomena of religion so as to be able to understand religious actors much better. Or think, for instance, of another very small but very critical intervention that was made by tell me I'm having not enough coffee. Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who said there are as many Islams as there are Muslims. Now you can imagine what this did was that it very subtly but very critically shifted the field from understanding how Muslims experience and express Islam, so that we didn't stay in the high level of discourse written by theologians, by Sufis, by philosophers, by the ulama, by the Kalam people, to actually try and understand what Islam meant on the ground. So that was another very critical intervention. But think of it this way also, that it changed our methodologies from being purely textual to actually taking into account sociological and anthropological methods of study. So there's a connection between theoretical frameworks and methodologies that are invoked. Then look at the third intervention that was made by the already mentioned Edward Said, whose loss we still mourn to this day. When he built on the work of Michel Foucault to actually examine how empire actually creates the mechanisms of otherization and racialization, and how power works. So that gave us an understanding of a larger intellectual history. Certainly, when you think of, and he makes the case that many departments of Oriental studies were actually launched during the time of empire, right? That how scholarship itself was embedded in larger political currents. We already know that scholarship, much as we try to claim that it is objective, is also itself shaped by the conditions of the time. So this is another kind of very interesting methodological insight that then comes into view because of theoretical framing. And my final example is what feminist studies did for us. Because feminist studies not only further grounded the insight that all knowledge is subjective, including scientific knowledge, which also is developed within its own social context. But what feminist theorizing did for us was to actually point to subjectivity in the form of how the body itself is an epistemic site that we learned through our bodies. And this then gave rise to looking at emotions and affect in how we construct our worlds and construct meaning and how we know what we know. So today, for example, we have a professor right here at IIS who is actually going to be looking at emotions in the Quran. This kind of work would have been unthinkable 2 or 3 decades ago. So that's why, when Aqil first came to me and said, I want to have a conference for graduate students. And I said, yes, absolutely, do it. And then he showed up a few days later and he said, but what should we have the conference on? And I said, methodology. And I was excited, and he was not. And he said, I'm not sure that will really have mass appeal. But the thing is, it is really, really important to actually look at the methodological insights or give a forum to students to talk about how they're connecting theory with the methods that they're utilizing in order to investigate their topics and what they're finding as a result. So with that, I will stop pontificating and sit down and let the conference get underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kassam. Your words inspire us all, truly. Very touched. Next, we have our first panel on contemporary Ismaili communities, chaired by Dr. Laila Halani and featuring Qais Batada and Hanifa Hakimi, who will be joining us online from my own home country, Canada. So over to you guys, please.
Okay. So lovely to see so many of you, but I know we are supposed to be very strict with timing, so we'll start straight away. I will introduce, I'll introduce both our speakers, and then we can start. Hanifa is a STEP educator based in Quebec, Canada, as Aqil said. She graduated from Concordia University with a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. She also has a Bachelor of Education from the University of British Columbia. Hanifa will be presenting her STEP MA dissertation in which she examined the Aga Khan Garden, Edmonton, from a critical theory of place-conscious perspective. I'm sure you're looking forward to listening to both our speakers who are dealing with really contemporary issues.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hanifa Hakimi, and I'm a recent graduate from the Secondary Teacher Education Program. Today, I'm presenting my MA research that explored pathways to reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and Ismaili Canadians using the Aga Khan Garden, Edmonton as a case study. Let's first establish the context and rationale behind undertaking this project. The Ismailis migrated to Canada from various African and Asian contexts since the 1950s, with significant increases in the 1970s and 1990s, when many Ismailis had to flee social and political challenges, such as the expulsion of Asians from Uganda, the Iranian Revolution, the collapse of Soviet Union, and the wars in Afghanistan. The encounter between Ismailis and Canada over the last decades have resulted in enriching dialogue, long-lasting initiatives, and creation of beautiful spaces such as the Ismaili Centers in British Columbia and Toronto, the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate and the Global Center for Pluralism in Ottawa, the Aga Khan Museum and Park in Toronto, and the most recent Aga Khan Garden in Edmonton. However, the adoption of a Canadian national identity by Ismailis and the creation of Islamic spaces on Canadian lands without considering issues of place and identity in today's post-colonial Canada are intrinsically problematic. Indeed, Canada is a settler nation whose creation involved the dispossession and dislocation of Indigenous peoples from their native lands. The settlement of the Ismaili community in Canada is, to an extent, a product of settler colonialism. It cannot be denied that the lands on which several Acadian projects have been commissioned are the traditional and ancestral territories of various Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Unfortunately, until today, open discussions around the role of the Ismaili Canadians in the ongoing healing and reconciliation processes with the Indigenous peoples have been rare. Reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, including Ismailis, is a high priority task for the Government of Canada, for which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was arranged from 2008 to 2015. One of the key principles of reconciliation is that all Canadians have the shared responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. Now that Ismailis have adopted the Canadian national identity and call Canada their home, part of the reconciliation solution requires self-reflection on the part of Ismailis in their existing engagements within Canadian societies as a way to move forward with greater knowledge related to Indigenous issues. Although the IIS secondary curriculum encourages STEP educators to raise awareness about contextually relevant issues, there is a lack of Indigenous subject material in the curriculum, as well as a framework or frameworks or approaches are missing for teaching contextually relevant issues. My MA research aimed to provide a pedagogical framework to STEP educators to start the dialogue on reconciliation between the Aboriginal communities and the Ismaili community of Canada, using place as a site of educational inquiry. To this end, the Aga Khan Garden, Edmonton, which is the most recent Canadian Islamic garden established by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, is taken as a case study. And as a sign of respect, I want to acknowledge that the Aga Khan Garden, Edmonton is located on the traditional and ancestor territories of the Treaties 6, 7, and 8 Aboriginal peoples. In examining a specific place, I am putting into practice the practice of critical place inquiry. Critical place research seeks to address critical place issues such as settler colonialism, globalization, and environmental degradation by developing methodological approaches that takes into account the embeddedness of social life and places. I chose the methodological framework of a pedagogical critical theory of place conscious inquiry among so many other methods that were available. This was proposed by Greenwood in 2012, and I chose it specifically because it considers decolonization and reinhabitation as interrelated aims of place conscious education. I believe that in today's post-colonial Canada, we cannot speak of decolonization without reinhabitation. And this framework invites place-based researchers and educators to look at 3 dimensions when studying any place: historical, sociological, and ethical. The historical dimension seeks to address the question of what happened here by finding information about the indigenous historical inhabitation of the place, as well as how indigenous people related to the place historically. The socio-ecological dimension seeks to examine what is happening here now today by focusing on the human-place relationships that acknowledge the ecological and cultural systems of the place. And lastly, the third dimension, the ethical dimension, seeks to formulate suggestions and insights on what should be happening here by focusing on processes of placemaking for the present-day inhabitants and critically reflecting on social and ecological issues related to the place. The critical place conscious inquiry of the Aga Khan Garden, Edmonton resulted in the following main findings. The historical dimension revealed that Indigenous land history and place-human relationships were missing. In all analyzed documents, there was no direct mention of the original inhabitants of the garden, Indigenous people's stories of the place, Indigenous place relationships, and even land acknowledgement were missing. This points to the fact that there is a lack of historical knowledge, and that is a barrier to reconciliation. The socio-ecological dimension resulted in discovering many parallels between Islamic and indigenous worldviews. First, both religious or spiritual tradition inspire an all-encompassing, inclusive worldview that does not separate God, i.e. spirit in the language of indigenous, human beings, and the natural world. Both Islamic and indigenous ecological worldview also emphasize the role of human beings as stewards of the earth and as servants of God. Third, both traditions believe in the idea of seeking balance and peace with nature and the universe. And so all these parallels found between indigenous and Islamic tradition imply that indigenous peoples can relate and may relate at a deeper level with the garden experience. Finally, the ethical dimension shed light on the importance of making indigenous knowledges and voices part of the management and experience of the garden. This can be done in many ways, such as collaborative initiatives with the local indigenous communities, taking into account the indigenous knowledge in the shaping of the landscape, irrigation, and culture system, incorporating indigenous art in the pattern making of the garden to enable the meaning making process for indigenous visitors of the garden. And lastly, making history visible, the history of the treaties 6, 7, and 8 indigenous people visible in all documents and in the garden itself. These findings highlighted many opportunities for dialogue and reconciliation with indigenous people. First, historical research needs to be conducted on Aboriginal communities of Treaties 6, 7, and 8 to understand their ways of connecting with the land and potentially engaging them in the activities of the garden. Second, indigenous voices should be brought into the management of the garden so that reconciliation can be advanced through the conservation of the land. And it was really ambiguous whether indigenous experts were consulted in the planning and creation of the garden. So it becomes even more important to include indigenous experts in the management leadership of the garden. By doing so, reconciliation through conservation and management of the garden can positively contribute to indigenous self-determination and agency. Lastly, a shared vision with indigenous communities can be created for the garden, taking the example of National Parks Canada and indigenous protective and conserved areas, which recently started to acknowledge Aboriginal people's historical presence, their knowledge of the land and processes, and the kind of contributions they can make to the management of the park. For the IIS secondary curriculum and teaching practice, the framework of critical place conscious inquiry can be used as a starting point to bring up discussion on Indigenous land history, settler inhabitation, decolonizing place, human-place relationships, and the complexities of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. This critical place conscious framework could potentially be integrated into the IIS secondary curriculum to discuss Ismaili re-inhabitation and decolonization in any part of the world where Ismailis are currently residing. It could frame this discussion of the Ismaili experience of migrating into new lands and creating new Islamic spaces, as well as inquire how human-place relationships work, the processes of placemaking and identity formation take shape in a post-colonial world. This pedagogical framework may especially be important for discussing post-colonial identities with Ismaili students who are navigating simultaneously their global Ismaili identity and their national Canadian identity. To conclude, I want to say that this research project has only scratched the surface of many under-researched areas in the contemporary scholarship. Scholarly work needs to be done on reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and Ismaili Canadians. Also, larger comparative studies must be conducted on Islamic and Indigenous ecological worldviews. Moreover, integrating environmental ethics with the tradition of Islamic gardening is a really new area of research, and AKTC seems to be a pioneer in using parks and gardens to promote the ethic of human stewardship. And this is something that needs to be explored further. And lastly, we need to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the creation and management of parks and gardens. And it is one of the most authentic ways towards reconciliation. And however, no formal investigation or academic research has been conducted. Hence, we need to think differently in terms of how do we want to bring Indigenous knowledge in the garden. Thank you so much for listening.